Welcome to the Future of Sharing, the series where we're going to be exploring the question, how do we make the sharing economy work for everyone? I'm Pete Leiden, I'm the founder of Reinvent, and I'm here today with Palak Shah, who is the Social Innovation Director at the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Welcome.
Thank you.
So give us a little bit about what is the organization about and also what you do within that.
Sure. The National Domestic Workers Alliance is the nation's leading voice for the millions of women who work as domestic workers. And domestic workers are the women who work as nannies, cleaners, caregivers, childcare workers. We often say that they're the women, and it's mostly women, who do the work that makes all of their work possible. The thing that unites these workers, these women, is that when they go to work, it's in the privacy of someone else's home. One of the little known facts about this workforce is that domestic workers have been excluded from virtually every labor law protection in this country. And so the Domestic Workers Alliance was formed to advocate for the rights, respect, and dignity of this workforce around the country.
How long has it been around for? Is it a recent
we were founded in 2007 through a very organic alliance. Domestic worker organizing has been happening for decades in this country, even going back to many decades ago of maid washerwomen strikes in the South, and there's a really rich history of domestic worker organizing. But in 2007, we realized that there was lots of work happening around the country, and 11 organizations all came together to form the National Alliance, and we're at 55 organizations around the country, all of whom voluntarily and politically affiliate with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and we're all united in that mission of improving the rights, respect, and dignity for this workforce.
But you're not technically, it's not like a union per se, is it more, but to someone who wouldn't understand it, what do you do, or maybe distinguish it from what a SEIU unionizing effort would be or something?
Well, domestic workers are one of the two groups of workers that are excluded from all of the labor law protections in this country. Domestic workers and farm workers were carved out of all of the labor law protections, which includes the right to unionize. So domestic workers actually don't have the legal right to unionize. And we can get into what that means for the future of work and the future of sharing, because in many ways, where domestic workers have been is where the future of work, we believe, is going.
That's an interesting way to think about it. Before we kind of get into some of these issues, you also are the founding director of an innovation lab of sorts. Do you explain a little bit about how that works and what it is and how it works?
And how it came about?
Yeah.
So when in my role at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, what I'm really focused on is expanding the tools and strategies that we have at the disposal of social movements. And social movements in this country, and especially our social movement, have relied on a kind of set of bread and butter tactics and strategies, right? We organize workers, we pass legislation, we build the power of individual domestic workers or low-wage workers, in the case of the low-wage worker movement, to lead and create an economy that's working for all of us. But what we realized, and for the longest time, the care and cleaning markets, right, have been underground markets, underground labor markets, informal markets, where it's been a cash-based, word-of-mouth market. There are two trends that are really changing this, that are causing us to form an innovation lab that's actually dealing with all of the rapid changes that are happening in the care and cleaning markets. The first is that the demand for care is growing exponentially. We've got a demographic shift underway, what some people call the silver tsunami, where we've 10,000 people turning 65 every single day. And the overwhelming preference of the baby boomer generation is to age in place at home and not be institutionalized. So that's actually going to create a tremendous demand for care, and there's all kinds of primary and secondary markets starting to emerge around care issues. The second is that the entrance of Silicon Valley and tech companies into the care and cleaning markets, which have been, as I said, underground and informal markets for decades, is rapidly disrupting the future of our workforce. And so Fair Care Labs, our innovation lab, was formed to actually figure out what are the interventions and strategies that we are going to have to invent to adapt to the rapidly changing markets.
Tell us a little bit, for those that don't really know about this, to what extent have these tech companies moved in there, and what's really happening in that space? Is it just a way to find work, organize work, get paid to work? I don't know, just to talk about what's going on in that space.
Well, to understand where we are today, it might be helpful to understand what the markets looked like before.
Yeah,
so, so domestic work has been primarily, as I said, a word of mouth market. And it's been really cash-based. And really, what's unique about the domestic work employment relationship is that it's a one-to-one employment relationship. So that's really where the traditional strategies of improving the lives of workers and building their power don't necessarily work in the same way, because when you think about what unions employ, collective bargaining and collective action strategies, those work because you've got lots of workers and one employer, but actually in domestic work, you just have one family and one worker. And so because of the very structural nature of the employment relationship, our movement, our social movement, has been forced to be pretty innovative and entrepreneurial in figuring out how we actually improve the lives of especially women who are really invisible and often work in the shadows. So because of that, it's been very, very difficult for our social movement to find and organize workers, right? So, and we've been very successful. We're one of the most successful social movements in this country right now in terms of passing legislation that extends very, very basic protections and ends all of these exclusions that I talked about, with the carve-outs for domestic workers. We passed a signature piece of legislation called the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights in lots of states around the country, and we've passed it in New York and California and Hawaii and Massachusetts and Oregon. We've got a bill waiting on the governor's desk in Illinois, and it's a pretty big victory because it's a Republican governor signing a bill on behalf of low-wage workers. But what's common throughout all of this is that even when we pass laws, right, that extend the most basic protections, minimum wage, overtime, things that you and I probably take for granted, that because of the disaggregated nature of the labor market and the fact that people work, every home is a workplace, it becomes really difficult to enforce those laws. Now, with the entrance of technology companies and Silicon Valley into these care and cleaning markets, we are seeing an unprecedented level of aggregation, both on the demand side and the supply side. And we think, and we hope that this is a real opportunity to both raise labor standards and organize workers into a social movement. But it's not a guaranteed outcome of the current moment. So from the perspective of domestic workers, there's kind of two motivations for us, right? One is this aggregation that I'm talking about that's happening, that's fundamentally restructuring the labor markets of the care and cleaning sectors. And then the second is that in some ways, domestic workers serve as a canary in the coal mine for where the future of work is going. Because we've been working in the so-called wild west of labor markets where there hasn't been regulation or there hasn't been really any protections, right? When you start to think about what's being talked about nationally in terms of the future of gig work and the future of the sharing economy and who's working in the sharing economy, you start to hear a lot of similarities between what domestic workers have faced for decades and where the future of work is going unless we actually figure out a very serious intervention.
Totally fascinating. The canary in the coal mine. I love that idea. So we're talking here about the sharing economy. I know there's been a lot of different ways people talk about that term even, whether they use it or not. But how do you layer what you're doing into the sharing economy? And the sharing economy, a lot of what the sharing economy is doing is it's taking someone, an individual who has something to share, whether it's their labor or kind of a tool or whether it's their home or whatever it is, and connecting it to someone else, individual, who wants to use that in some way. So it has a lot of clear parallels there. Do you see yourself as part of that sharing economy, or do you see it as a parallel thing? Or talk about how you think about the sharing economy.
Yeah, well, so I think the sharing economy, kind of has evolved as a catch-all phrase for all of the kinds of disruptions and innovations that are happening as technology kind of permeates a bunch of different industries and practices that were offline and now somehow becoming online. And so, I think what's kind of hard about the term is that it's kind of just shorthand, and everybody is thinking something different when they're talking about that term. Exactly. So we've been pretty clear to talk about things in terms of either the online economy or the gig economy. But really what our focus has been, and our entrance into the kind of sharing economy conversation, has been about what workers are facing as work moves from the offline markets into an online context.
So, so you don't necessarily think of yourself as part of the sharing economy, but part of that conversation about the sharing economy. You have a lot of insights, input, and also some kind of simpatico kind of issues that you're working with. Is that the way you think about it?
We see ourselves as part of, in some ways, we're a movement of low-wage workers. We are representing women in the economy who have been denied some of the very basic protections, and also been denied a lot of basic respect and dignity, because a lot of people don't see domestic work as real work. Now, there's a lot of similarities, I think, in terms of what the conditions that they're facing and what's happening as the kind of notion of what the sharing economy is broadens, right? Mm-hmm. And so it may have started out as something very specific, the sharing economy, and it actually it sounds like a very altruistic kind of origin to the whole thing. But I think it's now it seems to be a term that has kind of expanded to include a lot of the developments around the future of work and the way that work is changing.
Got you. That said, just to clarify this, for example, when people use home sharing services, if you use a place like that, there are domestic workers who often clean there, just like they're cleaning in a house or cleaning in a hotel. Or anyhow, there's a kind of a definitely practical and realistic connection of domestic workers into that economy, right?
Yeah, into that specific example, it is true, right? So new markets are being created, and that's creating potential opportunities for domestic workers to find good work, or potentially not. I mean, I think the chapter all of this is being written right now, and I think it's open. It could be really bad, or it could be really good, and I think it's going to take a kind of creative level of collaboration between a lot of different sectors across the country to figure out what the right level of interventions are going to be. I mean, Peter, I've been going around this country for the last year talking about the kind of creative collaboration that's going to be needed to actually get ourselves into an economy that's going to work for everybody. And for me, I don't think social movements alone are going to get us there. I don't think tech alone is going to get us there. I don't think government is going to get us there alone. But there's going to have to be, we've reached kind of the limits of what each one of these disciplines is going to be able to contribute to actually making a breakthrough and building an economy that works for all of us. And it's my hope that we're in a moment right now where the edges of these disciplines that don't necessarily, especially tech and social movements, who don't have a long history of working together, right? I mean, how is it that we can harness the power of all of the creativity that's happening both in the labor movement and in technology and come together in some really fundamentally new way to build an economy that's working for everybody, not just the customers, not just the investors, but the workers as well.
Interesting. And so let's talk about, you say it could be really good, could be really bad. Let's talk about really good. Let's just start with the promise or the potential here. From your perspective, what's a positive through line of how these technologies can improve the conditions and work better for the people you're representing, as well as work for everybody else as well? Do you have kind of thoughts on technology as, because some people look at technology as the disruptor, that's, oh my God, it's causing a problem. Others could look at the technology and say, oh my God, this could actually be a great opportunity. I mean, talk about the opportunities for now, and then we'll talk about some of the issues maybe.
Yeah, so we see technology as a tool. I mean, I don't think technology is good or bad per se inherently. And I think it actually has a lot of opportunity to improve the lives, of not just our workers, but all of us. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think that's the promise of the kind of economy and society that we can build that with technology integrated in it. The challenge, though, I think, is figuring out the challenge that we have right now, I think, is figuring out basically whose problems are we solving with the technology that we're inventing, and what problems are we solving with the technology that we're inventing, and whether the problems that we're solving, are we creating more problems than we're actually solving, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not to say that technology doesn't solve problems and can't improve our lives. The question is then what's happening after we make that intervention? Are there new problems that are getting creating, and how are we then taking steps to solve those problems? From my point of view, I think it's pretty foolhardy to try and stop the tide of technological progress. And I think instead what we should be trying to figure out is how we're harnessing the power of all of this technological change, the digital revolution that's happening, to ensure that we're building something, a society and a world that takes care of even the most vulnerable. Because if we're actually taking care of the most vulnerable through all of these changes, it's kind of like a rising tide lifts all boats.
Well, so let's take these little bit by little bit. So you described to me the case of the domestic worker up until now, which looks pretty isolated, pretty in the shadows. How do we even deal with that kind of world, as you mentioned? All of a sudden now you got a way to connect them all up.
That's right.
You got a way to rate them. You got to be able to understand what's happening. You can report things. Anyhow, that seems like a positive.
Yep.
Right? So there are literally concrete examples of how can be a positive
That's right.
situation at your side.
That's right. So I think for us, like a positive, I mean, I think it's a real opportunity to be harnessed, right? That the fact that both domestic employers and domestic, in the case of our specific case, that domestic employers and domestic workers are being aggregated through technology platforms or via technology. It may be a platform today, it might be something else tomorrow. And that has so much opportunity for us to meet our mission of raising the respect and dignity for workers. I don't think it will magically fall on top of our heads. So it's going to take some kind of intervention and a creativity and a level of collaboration to figure out how we actually do that. But the fact that the markets are aggregating in this way, for us, presents a tremendous amount of opportunity to improve the lives of our workforce. That may not be true in every sector and in every industry. And so I think part of the challenge in front of us today is to both be thinking generally about what's happening and then getting very specific about what the future looks like in one particular industry or set of issues or ideas versus another, and figure out what's generalizable and what is going to have to be sector specific. So for us, it's a really positive development that can really, really help us meet the mission of our social movement.
Okay, now on the other hand, just to kind of balance it out, what are some of the issues that worry you about the layering over of technology into this kind of domestic worker spaces? There's things that are cause you concern about things that could be done with the technology that couldn't have been done before that actually are detrimental or bad for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of two areas where where we're really spending a lot of our time. So one is, I've been thinking a lot about both the opportunities and the challenges for domestic workers and how work fundamentally shifts for humans as it gets distributed via an app. You no longer have a human that's talking to you about what you need to do or what you could do well or what you could do better, right? But instead now your boss is an app, and what does that do for the employment relationship? There's a set of really interesting questions that are emerging about the way that work is changing. I also think, though, there's a lot of lessons in terms of what we have experienced with 70 to 80 years of exclusion in terms of protections, and how the story of domestic workers can actually offer guidance as we start to grapple together, business and tech and government and all of us, labor, all of us together around how we move forward from the point that we are today. And so to that end, one of the interventions that we have made, as a kind of first offering into the space is a set of values and a very 8 simple value framework called the Good Work Code that is a roadmap of 8 principles to guide the online economy, especially as it starts to create work and move work that potentially that used to happen offline and starts to get distributed either through technology or online. So I think kind of where we are right now is it's such a formative stage of development. We're so early, but it's not day one, right? And we're not so entrenched that nothing can be shifted or changed. So we're at this moment, a really exciting moment, I think, where we have an opportunity to integrate our values into the way that technology is fundamentally restructuring the way that we live, work, and play.
So can you give us run through these in the 8 values? Can you give us a sense of what you?
Yeah.
So these are values that your experience or the experience of domestic workers over time and a long time. These are the values that you would love to see incorporated as forming the way we rethink the next system that should play out. Is that
so as these new models emerge, right? The tendency has been to pay more attention, right? Especially at early stage startups and you're just trying to survive. You're focused on the demand side of the platforms or, kind of figuring out what the business model is going to be or, just there's kind of very core business concerns that we're addressing. But what we're learning and what we're seeing is that if these platforms are actually going to succeed, there's going to have to be an equal attention to the supply side of the platforms, the workers, right? And the workers are also users and stakeholders in the platform. And so the idea was that as these new models emerge, could we offer a guiding framework for how to do that? So for example, safety. We all deserve to be safe at work. It's a very simple value, but what we were hearing, right, for example, for cleaners, was that given the kind of peculiarities and of the way that work happens on platforms, especially with the star systems and the ratings, what we were hearing from cleaners is they would get dispatched to a job, and then they would feel unsafe in a job because they're working in someone's home, and sometimes you're in weird situations. But they would be scared to leave the job because they were scared about how it would affect their rating on the platform. And so what we're saying is there's a number of, like safety, there's transparency, there's stability and flexibility, input and inclusion, shared prosperity. When the platform thrives, the workers should thrive too. There's a series of very simple principles. They're almost like design principles to offer to the folks who are building these platforms to figure out basically how to build something that's working for all of the stakeholders in the platforms.
Well, given that this is a big part of this whole series, is how does we make the sharing economy work for everyone? Without getting too thorough here, walk through those 8 in a way. Now, so you mentioned shared prosperity as a value. Do you take it another couple steps from that and say, and here's some ways we might do that, or here's some ways to do that,
Yeah.
or how do you talk about the shared prosperity one, which is an interesting one?
Yeah, I mean, it's, we're just in such an interesting time, Peter, where things are emerging and evolving every day. There's creative things that are happening, there are ideas that are coming from, not just from tech, but from labor as well. And we're seeing a level of leadership, I think, really emerge in the kind of sharing economy. There's a group of, I think, technology leaders that are embracing their role and responsibility in not only in kind of what they're building, but then the impact of what they're building externally. And so you have, when we launched the Good Work Code, we launched it last year with 12 tech companies who who came on board and publicly endorsed the 8 values and publicly committed to working on 2 of the 8 because from our point of view, we realize as you're building a company, it's hard to do everything on day one, but can we actually start to embed into the DNA of all of these models a commitment to a values-based economy? And so, for example, a company like Managed by Q, the CEO, Dan Turan, has introduced a stock options plan for the cleaners. He does a startup that basically works on office cleaning, commercial cleaning. So it's not our sector, but it's somebody who's employing and intersecting with historically low-wage jobs and figuring out how, as the platform thrives and grows, that the workers benefit as well. We're starting to see a real shift, I think, in the kinds of ways in which people are displaying the shared prosperity value. We have started to see the emergence of companies, like Juno, where they're reserving 50% of the equity for the drivers as they kind of build a competitor to the existing ride-sharing companies. So I think we're just at a time of reimagining and reinvention, and I think what my aspiration and hope has really been is that all of the power and creativity that we have utilized and displayed into building really amazing things in this part of the economy, how we can now apply that creativity to not just solve for efficiency, but to solve for equity as well.
Fascinating. Okay, let's go through a few more of these principles because it'd be interesting if they could apply in other contexts. You went through about 4 of them. So what are the other ones? Do you know off the top of your head there?
Yeah, so there's, I can run through them.
Yeah,
so there's safe and...
Okay, so safety makes, you
safety
kind of talked about that.
Right, okay, so then we've got transparency.
So say a few words on each of these.
So transparency really is about when everybody knows how things work, things just work better, right? And so what's really interesting about working in the kind of online and on-demand economy is sometimes it's really hard to know how things work. Part of that is because the models are iterating and the platforms are iterating and trying to find the kinds of things that will work. But part of it is also the way that these platforms are emerging is focused really primarily on the customer experience. That's really where most of the emphasis has been. And so what we're hearing from workers is you actually don't know what gets you fired or deactivated. You don't know what the relationship between your rating and wages is. You don't really understand if you get a 4-star rating after completing a job, whether that's actually going to lower your wage in any way, or is that going to be, is that good enough to actually get a pay increase? I mean, there's just all sorts of ways that when work is being distributed or mediated through an app or through your phone, where you don't really have anybody to ask the questions to, and you don't really know how things work. So the value of transparency is really to say we should be over communicating with all stakeholders in the platform about actually what is built into the algorithms, what is the algorithm optimizing for, and so that folks who are working in these situations can actually understand. And we all want that, right? We all want to know when you go to work, what do I need to do to be successful in this environment? And I think some of that is getting lost because of the flatness and the opaqueness of the way that the rules behind the way the apps work. They're not totally transparent. So that's another example.
Very helpful.
And I think that these aren't huge ticket items to fix. I mean, I think this is about where we direct our attention as we're building these different models and platforms, many of which are very exciting. But it's about how we're, who do we see as stakeholders on these platforms, and who do we see, who are we building these platforms for? And I think part of the challenge in all of this is that it's being built for customers right now, right, and investors. But that in order for these to really scale and succeed, we're going to have to pay attention to the worker side as well.
Love it, and actually it's very helpful to explain that transparency. And without harping on this, let's do a couple more ones because I think they're useful. So
Okay.
Give me another one.
So the third one that we've really spent a lot of time on is stability and flexibility.
Yeah, let's talk about that. That's an interesting one.
So one of the real exciting developments of the online and on-demand economy has been the flexibility that it does offer, right? But the
For everybody.
For everybody, yeah, for everybody, but especially for the workers, right? I mean, low-wage work in this country hasn't been a job that has been super respectful of workers, right? And the scheduling, I mean, there's many campaigns around the country right now about the way that scheduling really wreaks havoc on low-wage income, on the lives of low-wage workers. Mm-hmm. And so there is something really exciting that's emerging about the flexibility of the models. The problem is that as income inequality grows in this country, it's not enough to have flexibility because you have to have enough hours, right? So if you're not paid well for the work that you do, which low-wage work is by definition not paid well, then it's really important that you get enough hours. And that's, I think, where we haven't really figured out how to optimize the technology right now, right? So we've really figured out how to solve for flexibility, and that's great. And if the good news is that if you work in a profession that's really high paid, and you can kind of control the terms of your work, well then that flexibility is just basically icing on the cake. But I think for the kinds of workers that we represent in our sister and brother organizations, in restaurant work or in delivery work and those kinds of lower wage jobs, you have to be thinking both about flexibility and stability, right?
Interesting, totally. Totally makes sense. And that's why you connect those two. It's not just stability and then think about flexibility.
Exactly. It's about figuring out. And what I always say is if we can figure out how in under a minute to click a button on my phone and to get a car to show up to my door, we can probably figure out the complex algorithms it would take to not only solve for flexibility but also stability. We just haven't put our minds to it just yet.
Awesome. Any other one that you think it would be useful to call out of your principles here? Because they've all been good so far.
Yeah, so we have a value that I think is really important for those of us who are advocating for workers, and that's one of input and inclusion. So what we're hearing, right, is, and this is partly just the nature of fast iteration, right? Your features change and specific buttons and features and business practices will change as models develop, right? We're in a period of reinvention and reimagination. Mm-hmm. But as that happens, it's really important to see workers as users of these platforms and stakeholders in the platforms. And in fact, it actually makes a lot of business sense to be incorporating the feedback of workers as you build the models. And surprisingly, what I found is that we're just building our muscle, especially in the tech community and in kind of Silicon Valley, on how to pay attention to the supply side and how that can actually feed into building not just ethical models, which we of course are really concerned with, but also really strong business models.
Awesome. Any final one you want to mention here? But not final for the interview, but final principle there, because they're interesting principles. Honestly, everyone's been useful.
Yeah, so growth and development is one that we've spent a lot of time on. So thinking about how in the course, we all want to grow and learn at work, right? We all are trying to advance ourselves and grow ourselves. So I think what's really, to me, I find the 8 principles, I find the 8 principles that we've come up with to be fairly common sense. They're the kinds of things that you and I would want when we're working somewhere. And we've been, as a kind of first offering into the space, we've been really direction setting with it, right? Knowing that as new models emerge, we're going to have to, it's going to mean something different in different parts of the digital economy, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're working in crowdsourcing or digital work, the value of safety is going to look really different than if you're dispatching cleaners or if you're driving, cars. Versus, shared prosperity may look more similar, right? If it's about basically as you turn to generating real profit and revenue, how that's really shared with all of the people who are powering the platforms.
Interesting. Now, a lot of good ideas there. We've talked about a bunch of them there. You mentioned how we've reached this moment where, from the worker side, from the technology company side, from the city side, we've kind of done what we can together. So we're entering this next period. How big a window do you think we have here to kind of figure this out? And what's, do you feel it's a relatively small window here? And if so, why is that?
I think we're in a really, really critical moment right now in terms of figuring out how we're going to build an economy that works for all of us. And I personally believe that the window for that is very, very short. I think what's happened over the last year or two is that there's been, at least on the issues of workers in the kind of new economy, is that the pressure of the kind of misclassification lawsuits have created a crisis and a level of scrutiny and focus on what's happening in this part of the economy. And I think that for the first time in decades, there's a national conversation about workers. And I think that that's a real opportunity and an opening. There's a lot for us to figure out, but what I fear is that there is a kind of genuine moment, a genuine openness in parties on both sides, in technology and in labor or in social movements, where we could actually sit down together and figure out how, instead of having an adversarial relationship, how is it that we could really join forces and build an economy that works for all of us? Social movements aren't going to get there on our own, and I don't think tech is going to get there on its own. So how is it that we create the space, the relationships, the joint and shared vision around where we're trying to go? Because if we can't agree on where we're trying to go, it's going to be very hard to actually figure out how we get there, right? So this is that moment right now, and I think, what I've always really admired about the entrepreneurs and folks in the technology community is this kind of orientation that we're solving problems, right? I've really admired that, and I think that speaks to a lot of people, beyond the technology community. But the question that I always return to is, whose problems are we solving, and are we creating more problems than we're solving, right? So how is it that we can, and social movements, that's what we do. We identify the problems that are getting created in society, and we organize for social change, right? So we can be very important partners in identifying, surfacing, and naming what's not working, right? We know what is working, and that part's exciting. Let's figure out what's not working and really have a commitment to integrating these kind of two areas of work, naming what's not working and what is working, and figuring out how the two combine. That's not going to happen on its own, right? And it's going to take a level of commitment and imagination, and frankly, a level of trust that hasn't really existed before. And I'm not naive, right? I mean, there's a lot of challenges that are emerging, that are, some of which precede the digital revolution, and some of which are being accelerated by the digital revolution. But there are other forces at play, the growing income inequality, the growing political polarization in this country. So it makes it difficult for me to imagine, especially in this current moment, that without some level of really creative collaboration, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to look to the federal government for solutions to this right away, right? Because we have an incredible amount of political dysfunction in this country right now. So there is this opportunity, right? There is this opportunity to not camp, right? To not get polarized, but to actually really be committed. And what we have surfaced through the Good Work Code is, right, there is some small group of companies and technology leaders who are willing to embrace their role in figuring out what the solutions are, right? I mean, there's definitely a group of companies that are shirking their responsibility, and that has always been true, in the history of capitalism and kind of in the emergence of the corporation. But it's also true that there are those who actually see this as a time for business leadership, for technology leadership, and that they are embracing the role that they have to play, right? Not to say that it's an oversized role, but that if you're making disruptions in the economy, and that those have a ripple effect, that you have a responsibility to figure out how we're going to mitigate those impacts. So I do think we are at this time, but that is going to close, because as things get politicized and as things get polarized and as kind of camps start to form, we have this danger of returning to it would be a real missed opportunity in my mind. I think a real missed opportunity.
I mean, I know it's hard to quantify it, but when you keep saying a small window, is there any way to ballpark that in your mind, just as a guess? I mean, it's hard to say, but are we talking?
I think we're talking maybe a couple of years.
Couple years. So we're gonna
We have a couple of years, I think.
It's interesting, and folks I've been talking to, I've been hearing 18 months people have thrown on. I mean, there is a kind of a sense that there's a time here to do something or look at a problematic. So a couple things about this. You did not explicitly you mentioned the federal government, which, as we all know, has got its levels of dysfunction at some level. But you didn't really mention city governments, or at least didn't explicitly in this part of the conversation. Is there a role to help convene and really broker this and figure this out from kind of the government side? Because we've talked about the tech side responsibility, and we've talked about your kind of workers side or social movement side.
What's the role of government?
What do you see as the role of government in this moment here?
I mean, the role of government always is to write the rules of the game, right? So the government is going to have to play a really, really important role in figuring out how we set the rules of the game. And that's helpful for everybody. It creates a level of stability in the markets. It creates floors in markets. It creates a level of a kind of shared playing field upon which we can then have all kinds of innovation and disruption. So I do think, given the political climate at the federal level, that the role that government, the kind of early role of government, is going to have to be at the state and municipal levels. And that's been our strategy as well in terms of advancing the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. And we've been passing legislation at the state level, and we're experimenting now with municipal level policies. So I do think that is going to be the level at which government is going to play a role. I think where we're going to have some challenges is that because all of this is fundamentally being reinvented, every few months there's something new that's happening. We're going to have to be really, really smart and thoughtful about what rules we're setting into place today that can kind of not be timeless, but not be outdated, within a few years. And so that's going to take a level of real creativity. And it's going to take, we're going to have to agree on what is it that we're trying to accomplish, right? And the challenge right now with fighting things out in the political process is you get camped in the interests. Instead of actually, if we could figure out together with government, like a tripartite alliance of some kind, right? Like the government, social movements, and in this case, the technology sector, the business tech, what are we actually trying to do here? If we can get to some high level shared vision, and I do think, my general sense is that from all the leaders I've talked to in Silicon Valley, people do want to be responsible members of our society. So we're going to have to figure out then the specifics of what actually has to get codified in the law, right? And then what are things like the Good Work Code that are actually becoming business norms or technology norms in the sector as the models mature and as we kind of have more and more entrants and players in this space.
I'd agree with you that your assessment though about a lot of goodwill, I think, and a lot of good shared commitment, honestly, to the long-term vision coming from the tech community, entrepreneurs, and technologists. I don't think there's a...
But it's not that it hasn't been controversial, right? I mean, there's been a lot of controversy out there about the impact that this new part of the economy has created, whether it's in worker rights or whether it's in gentrification or whether it's in... there's a whole host of issues that are affected by the development of these new models. And so I think what's needed in this moment, I think we're fundamentally in a moment of leadership. This is a leadership question. Who is prepared to really lead, right? Not just lead your own interests, but actually lead in building a society, an economy, a world that's actually working for the majority of people that live on this planet.
Couldn't agree more, and that's again what this project in many respects is trying to do. Not that we're the leaders, but we're trying to catalyze that conversation to get that leadership kind of moving.
But there's a lot of friction, right? So
totally.
There's friction between, different edges of the issues that people are working on and the point of view that they're coming from. And that friction is very important, I think, that it's from that friction that I think we're going to get to see some breakthroughs, right? But it requires everybody to approach the friction with a level of forward-looking problem solving, right? Not just a kind of camping. The camping, I think, is what's going to become really, really difficult to then make breakthroughs.
One of the things that we're just trying to clarify in these interviews is how much do we think the current regulatory landscape is adequate for solving this, and how much reinvention or new sets of regulations that are more tailored to this era's issues needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So on that issue, I guess what I would say is, I'm kind of two minds about it, right?
Okay, fine.
So the first is that, in some ways, the exploitation of workers has been happening for generations.
Mm-hmm.
And, just because something is happening offline and then you move it online doesn't necessarily mean that it's innovative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of one set of ideas that are people were going to work, and gig work existed in the offline economy, and it now exists in the online economy, and it's being mediated a different way, but especially in the case of domestic workers, domestic workers are the original gig workers in some way, right? So in some ways it's not that different. And then in some ways it actually is really different, right? In terms of the kinds of changes that we talked about. The employment laws that we have in place right now are really, really important in protecting workers. In the future, it may be important to update those laws, but the outcomes should still be the same, right? Which is to give very, very fundamental protections. We're not talking about big protections. We're talking about the right to minimum wage, the right to a break, the right to rest, the right to a weekend, the right to be able to speak your mind at work and not get fired. Like, those are the kinds of things that create the building blocks of a democratic society, right? I mean, if you feel like you can't actually speak your mind at work, or actually, and for good reasons too, for improving things at work, and that you risk being fired or you risk being retaliated at, those are all parts of the building blocks of work. I mean, the way that the amount of time that we spend at work is a key part of building a democratic society. So those protections are in place, I think, for a very, very good and important reason. Now, as business models change, there may be a need to update some of those laws, and I'm open to that. But what I'm not open to is kind of eroding those protections, right? Because it's more fundamental than ever as we kind of move away from the traditional protections that we saw in the manufacturing economy and the industrial economy, as the kind of 40-hour job with a pension and benefits, as that kind of starts to become a relic of the past, we are going to have to figure out how in this kind of new way of working, much of which precedes the sharing economy, right? I mean, this transition to gig work and a freelance economy has been happening for a long time before the emergence of the digital revolution and changing the ways of work. But it's this part of the economy is shining a new light on the challenges that workers are facing as the historic relationship that we've had in terms of benefits and protections to an employer, as that starts to disintegrate. So we are going to have to figure out what do new kinds of protections for workers look like. That may utilize the existing frameworks that we have, and it may require some tweaking and changing. But the thing that I can't emphasize enough, given our experience of representing workers who for 70 years have been in the Wild West of labor markets without any protections whatsoever, is that is fundamentally a disastrous road to go down. Because very, 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 very basic protections, without even those, like our workers have been some of the most vulnerable, marginalized, invisible people in our economy. And we don't want to expand the group of people that are facing those conditions. And so figuring out how we solve for that, right? Fundamentally, the economy is about people, right? Fundamentally, the economy is not about profit, it's about people. It's about the people who power the economy, it's about the people who are benefiting from the economy, it's about the people who are being productive in the economy. And so figuring out how the very people that are powering all of these new changes, right? At this point, there's still people behind all of this. How we're figuring out how we protect them is going to be one of the most fundamental questions that we're going to have to tackle together. Not just in labor, not just in government, but all of us together at the table.
Love it. Although you were alluding very subtly there to what might be on the horizon through artificial intelligence and robotics, and there might be another challenge on the horizon here that we'll have to really think about.
There is, and I think we're going to have to fundamentally figure out the relationship between humans and technology, right? We're going to have to fundamentally figure out the relationship between the economy and technology, right? And how all of those pieces come together. I mean, if it is true, right, that we are going to see more automation in the future and we're going to see more jobs replaced, well, I mean, in some ways, that might give us more time to do the things that we love, but that's not a guarantee. If you look at the history of capitalism and you look at the history of who gets to benefit from a lot of the changes that are happening in the economy, it hasn't been the majority of people. We've seen a real kind of fundamental, there's a kind of increase in the precariousness of most people in this world. So how we figure out how to kind of turn that around and figure out how technology works for us and we're not working for technology, right? How do we harness the power of technology to build a world where people can really make their way in this world and be their full potential, to be the full humans, that oftentimes the kind of economy that we have right now doesn't, it's so difficult to survive at the bottom of this economy right now. And technology can play a really important role in relieving that pressure on most of us. But as I said before, it's not going to happen magically. It's going to happen because we really make it a decision, and we have a real intention to make it that way.
So we don't want to go backwards necessarily, although we don't also unravel the things backwards. But you talked about this polarization or this hardening of positions that's currently happening in this sharing economy or broader kind of online gig economy.
I think it hasn't quite happened yet.
Okay.
I think it's
we'll talk about
it could start to happen, but it's happening in lots of other parts of the national political conversation and other issues as well, right? So we see that kind of camping, especially even as we're looking at the way that the election is unfolding right now. And there's just so much polarization that's happening in the country right now.
But in terms of the let's say the sharing economy discussion we're talking about here, given your caveats of how you guys fit in that, do you feel you do see some kind of clustering of positions that are starting to harden? Talk a little bit more about how far that's gone and what might be ways to kind of loosen that up and get people collaborating a little bit more. I mean, I think you're right. There seems to be something like, certainly we're not fully collaborating. On the other hand, we're not totally polarized. So talk about your own analysis about where we are in that process and what would help it.
I mean, I've been very encouraged by the kind of openness that I have seen, like slight, there's a slight openness on all of the different perspectives that are intersecting with the sharing economy, with the exception of a kind of, there's probably a few examples where positions have really, really hardened. And I think that's probably unavoidable. There's going to be, in all of the kinds of disruptions and changes, in my experience with social change, there's always kind of a faction of good actors and a faction of bad actors. And that will probably continue to happen. But in the space where there is kind of, in the space where things haven't fully camped, there is room. But I think what that's going to take is a level of very, very serious listening and very, very serious engagement in a way that it's really not a muscle that we're asked to focus and develop on in a kind of instantaneous, on-demand, 24 news cycle type of world, right? But to really build relationships and collaboration, it takes both time and it takes will and it takes trust. So, I'm a fairly optimistic person, and I would like to believe that that's the case. I'm not naive, because there's kind of layering under all of this, and we haven't really talked about this, is the kind of investor class, right? That's actually funding and has a very kind of particular type of interest in the way that the models develop. And so, I was just at the Personal Democracy Forum, and Doug Rushkoff gave a very rousing speech as the kind of closing speaker of the Personal Democracy Forum about the role, how we really can't ignore the role of capitalism in determining the outcomes, especially in this new part of the economy. And I agree with that. And yet at the same time, I do think that there, because of some of the particularities of the business model, right, and the fact that in order to scale and grow the supply side of platforms, there's not just an ethical case, but there's actually a business case in treating workers well. I do think that there's a slight opening and some alignment here to figure out how we actually build models that work. Now, I will tell you that technology is not the exclusive domain of Silicon Valley and venture capitalists. And there's a growing movement, on the East Coast of something called platform cooperativism. Trevor Schultz and Nathan Schneider have been really leading a really interesting reimagination of platforms, in a way of thinking about platforms as the commons. And that maybe in a future democratic society, platforms are actually not proprietary, but they're actually owned by the people. And that, folks like Marina Gorbis at the Institute for the Future will say she fully expects that the platforms of today will evolve into the operating system for labor markets in the future. Well, if that's the case, then who gets to decide how the platforms are run, right? Who gets to decide what the fundamental terms of the way that these labor markets or operating systems are going to function? I mean, to me, a key question that's emerging, right, is it's one thing in the early days of this, right, where there's kind of, you're solving a very, acute problem, right? I can't find parking, I need somebody to do on-demand valet. But if this actually is increasing and transforming the way that most labor markets operate, and we're starting to see that, right? It started with, certain kinds of work, and now we see massage therapists and doctors and all kinds of professions that are moving into the online space. If more and more of us are going to work in this way, then a fundamental question that has, been a burning question for me is who gets to decide? Who really gets to decide how the future norms of work are going to be, what the terms of that work are going to be, what the what the penalties and the opportunities and the rewards of that work are going to be, that to me is a very, very fundamental question. And the models are still quite young, right? But if they take hold and they really expand, and more and more and more of us are working in this way, then we are going to have a process that goes beyond, the CEO of a company, or the kind of community managers, or the people who are the engineers who are building these platforms. That decision-making process of how these labor markets function is going to have to be it's just going to have to be broader than that, right? Especially if we start to think about the relationship between the economy and democracy. And that democracy isn't just something that we do at the polls, but democracy is kind of a way of life. And so how do we democratize the economy is going to be, I think, a very, very urgent question that's going to take hold in a much bigger way around the country, especially because of how dire income inequality has become, right? And so that most people are barely surviving in this economy right now. And that's why I think you're seeing the success of social movements like Fight for 15 right now, and political movements like Black Lives Matters. I mean, all of this stuff is coming together in a very serious way. And fortunately or unfortunately, the role that technology, Silicon Valley, and these kinds of, today they're platforms, tomorrow they may be something else. The way that all of these things intersect are going to be key fundamental questions for building an equitable society.
One last thing to pull out of that conversation, though, is you mentioned we really haven't discussed the role of basically venture capital or the investors. So you see them as a distinct player, distinct kind of from, let's say, the founders, managers of a lot of these companies? And if so, describe the different. How do you differentiate about that?
I mean, I think they're distinct actors, obviously, but when I talk to entrepreneurs and founders about the Good Work Code and implementing the values and these principles into the new models that they're building, there is always a kind of burning pressure in the back of their minds about how their investors are going to respond. And the kinds of returns that they are expected, the kinds of, the financial kind of, the bottom line implications of investing in workers. Now we're starting to see a really interesting body of research, really led by some folks at MIT, Zainab Tan and others, about how investing actually in low-wage workers, and most of her research has focused on offline and retail workers, like kind of people who work at like the Gap and other kinds of low-wage retail jobs, how that actually increases and boosts productivity, right? So that there's actually a business benefit to investing in the supply side and in low-wage workers and actually improving conditions of work. I think the level of creativity that we have seen in a very short amount of time emerge from this part of the economy, if we can actually figure out how to harness that, to not just solve the problem, to kind of meet the needs of investors, but actually meet the needs of ordinary people. If we could actually combine those two things in some way, we may have an opportunity to really fundamentally shift the course of history here.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you, that seems like a pretty good place to wind down. But one last question. You mentioned you're a pretty optimistic person, but
I'm not naive.
So
I understand how capitalism works. I understand how venture capital works.
So, but this 2-year window, if we're going to have a conversation 2 years from now, what's your gut feeling of how happy we'll be, or how kind of distraught we'll be in this conversation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it's my hope. It is my hope that we will be sitting here reflecting on the various experiments that we've seen emerge in the space, and that we will fundamentally believe that we're making progress towards human equity and building a society and an economy that works for all of us. There's a part of me that's really scared that things will always devolve into the way that things have always happened, and I think the chapter is being written right now. It's going to be, like the 12 companies that took an active leadership in the Good Work Code stepping up and saying, yes, we have a responsibility to our workers. It's going to be, thought leaders like yourself and others who are creating space for really thoughtful, authentic conversation I think, you know, there's a lot, everyone is going to have to do their part from their vantage point in the role that they sit to shift the conversation, because the power, the trajectory that we're on, we're not going to end in a way that I think is going to be beneficial for most people in the economy. But I am very optimistic, given the moment that we're in, that the combination of social movements, the kind of creativity from Silicon Valley, the responsibility to solve problems, right? All of that comes together in a way that we start to build a new economy that is working for everybody, but time will tell.
We'll see you back in 2 years. We're going to do this up. Anyhow, that's a perfect way to end the conversation here, which has been an awesome conversation and made me, and I hope others, really think. Thank you.